In the sprawling city of Chicago, there was no name more respected or feared than Michael Anders. The billionaire mogul was a towering figure in the tech world, known for his ruthless business tactics and unmatched success. But beneath the polished exterior of his empire lay a story of love, loss, and unrelenting desperation. Michael's mother, Eleanor Anders, was the cornerstone of his life. She wasn't just his mother, she was his hero. A widowed seamstress, Eleanor had raised Michael single-handedly, building a small clothing business into a regional powerhouse. Her resilience and unwavering determination became the foundation of Michael's ambitions. But life had a cruel way of testing even the strongest of bonds. One fateful day, Eleanor collapsed while inspecting a factory floor. The diagnosis was grim. A rare neurological disorder had left her comatose, and medical experts gave Michael little hope for her recovery. No matter how much money he poured into treatments, therapies, and cutting-edge research, her condition remained unchanged. Michael sat by her bedside for days on end, his heart heavy with despair. The bustling city beyond the hospital walls felt like another world, one he no longer belonged to. One night, as he rested his head on the edge of Eleanor's bed, a quiet voice startled him. "Not all battles are won with money." Michael turned to see an old man, frail yet strangely commanding, standing by the door. His face bore the marks of a life lived hard, but his eyes sparkled with an almost otherworldly wisdom. "Who are you?" Michael asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. The man introduced himself as Father Julian, a retired priest who volunteered at the hospital. Michael brushed him off at first, dismissing his presence as another well-meaning stranger offering empty platitudes. But Father Julian persisted, and over the course of their brief conversations, his words began to linger in Michael's mind. One evening, Father Julian spoke with an urgency Michael hadn't seen before. "There is a way," he said softly. "A path that may save your mother, but it will demand everything from you." Michael's brow furrowed. He was no stranger to sacrifice, but he didn't understand what Father Julian meant. "You must strip away your wealth, your identity, everything that makes you who you are. For 48 days you must live as those who have nothing. Beg for your sustenance. Endure the scorn of society. Only then will your mother's spirit find the strength to fight." The idea was absurd, almost laughable. But something in Father Julian's eyes, an unshakable conviction, kept Michael from dismissing it outright. "What if I fail?" Michael asked. "Then her fate is sealed." Michael wrestled with the decision, his heart torn between disbelief and a gnawing hope he dared not trust. In the end, his love for Eleanor outweighed his pride. He vowed to undertake the journey, though the details of how and where were left to him. On a cold November morning, Michael left behind the glittering penthouse that overlooked Lake Michigan. Dressed in tattered clothes and armed with nothing but a small backpack, he ventured into the heart of the city, a place he had long ruled from boardrooms but never truly understood. He chose to start near the South Side, a part of Chicago that had become synonymous with hardship. The first day was a rude awakening. The stares from passers-by ranged from pity to contempt. A businessman with an expensive briefcase sneered as Michael sat on a bench near a bustling intersection. "Get a job," the man muttered under his breath, his words cutting deeper than Michael expected. Michael realized he had no idea how to beg. The humiliation was worse than anything he'd experienced in his cutthroat business dealings. For hours he sat in silence, his pride waging a brutal war against his determination. By nightfall, hunger gnawed at him. He had earned nothing. The cold bit through his thin jacket as he found shelter under a bridge, surrounded by other homeless individuals. Most avoided eye contact, lost in their own struggles, but one man, a grizzled veteran named Sam, offered Michael half of a stale sandwich. "You're new to this," Sam said, his voice rough but kind. Michael nodded, unsure of how to respond. "You'll learn quick," Sam continued. "Out here you have to. Or you don't make it." Those words stuck with Michael. He realized that survival required more than just enduring the physical discomfort. It demanded humility and adaptability. Over the next week, Michael began to settle into his new reality. He observed the rhythms of the streets, the unwritten rules of survival. He discovered that certain intersections were prime spots for begging, but they were fiercely guarded by those who had claimed them. One day, Michael tried his luck near a crowded subway entrance. He crafted a simple cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. Anything helps." He sat with his head down, avoiding eye contact as coins and occasional dollar bills trickled into the cup he held. But the streets were not without their dangers. Late one evening, as Michael counted the day's earnings in a dimly lit alley, he was confronted by a group of men. Their leader, a wiry figure with a scar running down his cheek, sneered at him. "This your spot now?" the man asked, his tone mocking. Michael shook his head, trying to defuse the situation. "I'm just passing through." The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Doesn't work like that. You want to beg here, you pay up?" Michael stood his ground, though fear coiled in his stomach. "I have nothing to give." The man lunged, snatching the cup from Michael's hand and scattering the coins across the pavement. A scuffle ensued, and Michael was shoved to the ground, his ribs aching from the impact. Before the situation could escalate further, Sam appeared, wielding a rusted pipe. The gang retreated with jeers, leaving Michael bruised but alive. "Welcome to the jungle," Sam said, helping him to his feet. That night, as Michael sat by a fire shared with Sam and a few others, he began to understand the unspoken camaraderie among those who had nothing. Despite their hardships, they looked out for one another in ways that Michael found humbling. By the third week, Michael's transformation was undeniable. His face, once clean-shaven and immaculate, was now hidden beneath a scruffy beard. His hands, accustomed to signing contracts worth millions, were calloused from the daily grind of survival. But amid the struggle, there were moments of unexpected grace. At a soup kitchen, Michael met Angela, a volunteer with a warm smile and an unshakable belief in the goodness of people. She listened to his fabricated story of hardship without judgment and encouraged him to keep going. Angela's kindness reminded Michael of his mother's teachings. Eleanor had always emphasized the importance of giving back, even when their family had struggled in the early days. In those quiet moments, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just enduring this ordeal for his mother, he was gaining a perspective he had long forgotten. As the 48 days stretched on, Michael's journey became a mosaic of pain, growth, and unexpected connections. He witnessed the resilience of those who lived on the margins of society, their stories etched into the corners of their weary smiles. And through it all, one thought sustained him, the hope of seeing his mother's eyes open once more. The days had blurred into one another, each a mirror of the last, yet each uniquely its own. The once powerful and untouchable billionaire had been reduced to a figure of quiet desperation, yet in his heart, a flicker of hope remained. Hope that, somehow through all of this, he would find the strength to change his fate and his mother's as well. The streets had become both his greatest challenge and his unexpected teacher, stripping him of everything he thought he knew about survival, dignity, and strength. Michael's pride had been shattered long ago, but it was his humanity that was being tested now. He had long passed the point of discomfort. Now he was teetering on the edge of something more profound. As the days passed, Michael became acutely aware of the world around him, its cruelty, its indifference, and its rare moments of kindness. The cold had become unbearable. Every morning, Michael woke up shivering in the abandoned building where he had been sleeping, surrounded by others who had nothing but the hope of finding something, anything, to eat or drink that day. He had come to rely on the makeshift family that had formed among the city's homeless. Sam, the grizzled war veteran, had become his closest ally. Together, they had shared stories of better days, of love lost and battles fought. Despite the hardship, Michael found himself clinging to Sam's friendship like a lifeline. One night, Sam pulled Michael aside after dinner, his weathered face grave with concern. "You're changing, Mike," Sam said, his voice low. This life, it doesn't forgive. But there's something in you. I can see it. You're stronger than you realize." Michael didn't know how to respond. What was strength anymore? Was it in the ability to endure pain, or was it something deeper? His body had grown weaker from the constant strain, but his resolve was still unshaken. He didn't know where this journey was taking him, but he was too far in to back out now. The streets, however, weren't kind to those who lingered too long. After a month of begging on various corners, Michael's presence had started to attract attention he didn't want. He had learned quickly that in this world, nothing was free, not even the smallest corner of a sidewalk. The other homeless residents of the area had their turf, their space, and if you weren't careful, you'd find yourself on the wrong end of an angry confrontation. One evening, while sitting on a corner near a bus stop, Michael felt someone's gaze on him. It was a woman, middle-aged, with dark circles under her eyes, and a hardened expression that suggested she had seen more than her fair share of the world's brutality. She approached him, her movements slow but deliberate. "You're new here," she said, her voice tinged with suspicion. "This corner's taken." Michael looked up at her, trying to hold her gaze. He had grown accustomed to people ignoring him, walking past him as if he were invisible, but something about this woman made his stomach twist. It was as if she could see through him, see the remnants of the man he once was. "I'm not here to take anything," Michael replied quietly, trying to remain calm. The woman narrowed her eyes, scrutinizing him. Then, to Michael's surprise, she sat down next to him. She didn't say anything at first, only watched the steady stream of people passing by, their faces a mixture of indifference and apathy. "You're not one of them," she finally said. Michael was taken aback. "What do you mean?" She nodded toward the other homeless people further down the street. "You don't belong here. You're not like them." Her voice softened as she added, "You still have hope. Most of us gave that up a long time ago." Michael felt his chest tighten. It was true. He didn't belong here. He didn't belong in the streets in this life. But for the first time, he realized that perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe the pain, the humiliation, the struggle, maybe they were part of a greater purpose, something he couldn't yet see. "I'm not giving up," he said quietly, though the words felt unfamiliar on his tongue. The woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "You'll make it," she said finally. "But you need to learn to see the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. That's the only way you'll survive." Her words lingered with him long after she left, and over the next few days, Michael began to see the world differently. He no longer viewed it through the lens of wealth and privilege. He began to notice the small acts of kindness, the woman who handed him a warm coffee, the man who shared his blanket with a fellow stranger, the young boy who offered him $1 without hesitation. These were the things that kept the world turning, the things that made the impossible bearable. But as the days wore on, Michael felt the strain of the journey weighing heavier on him. He hadn't heard from Father Julian since the day he'd first embarked on this madness, and he wondered if the priest had truly meant for him to survive in this way. Was this the path to redemption? Or was he merely being punished for a life he had taken for granted? The struggles of survival were constant. One day, Michael found himself in the middle of a heated argument between two men fighting over a discarded box of food. The shouting, the pushing, the violence. It was a world of chaos and fear that Michael had never known before. The thought crossed his mind again, is this really what it takes to save my mother? That question haunted him as he walked through the streets in the dead of night, searching for shelter, searching for a way forward. He had given up so much already, his wealth, his pride, his dignity, but had it brought him any closer to his goal? The pain in his heart, the agony of seeing his mother helpless, was still as raw as it had been on day one. He hadn't found an answer yet, and so he pushed forward. Each step on the cracked pavement was a step toward something unknown. Every day he battled the elements, hunger and fear. The mental and physical toll of living in this new world was beginning to take its toll, but he refused to stop. In the dim light of another cold, lonely morning, Michael's phone buzzed. He hadn't checked it in days, but the notification caught his attention. It was a text message from his assistant, Laura. The words on the screen were simple: "Your mother's condition has worsened. The doctors say there's no hope left." The message felt like a punch to the gut. He dropped to his knees on the sidewalk, the cold air biting at his skin, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to break down. Was this all for nothing? The tears fell freely, but amidst the crushing weight of despair, Michael felt something shift inside him. This pain, this grief, it wasn't the end. It was a catalyst. He couldn't let her go. He couldn't let everything he had fought for be in vain. "I'm coming for you, Mom," he whispered into the cold night air. "Just hold on. I'll find a way." The days blurred into weeks, and the struggle of survival continued to test Michael in ways he never thought possible. The street was now more than a place. It had become his reality. He had long shed his former identity, the businessman with suits and boardrooms, and had become a man who scavenged for scraps, who begged for change, who learned the hard truths of life by the hour. Yet, despite all the pain, despite all the hunger and humiliation, he was still breathing. And that, Michael thought, meant something. At least for now. His thoughts often drifted back to his mother. He would lie awake at night, shivering from the cold, his mind racing with images of her frail, weak body lying in a sterile hospital room. The doctors had given up on her, but Michael wouldn't allow himself to give up. Not yet. One night, as he wandered the dimly lit streets, a familiar face appeared before him. It was Sam, the war veteran who had become his mentor of sorts. The old man's face was haggard, his eyes tired, but there was a flicker of something, hope perhaps, beneath the weathered exterior. "Mike," Sam said, his voice rough, "I've been watching you. You ain't the same guy you were when you first got here. I've seen men go through worse and break. You've got a fire inside you, something that ain't been snuffed out yet. You just gotta find a way to fan that fire, kid." Michael didn't know what to say. Sam was right. He had changed. But had he changed enough? Was he really strong enough to make it out of this mess? He felt the weight of his failures pressing down on him with every step. His mother's situation seemed to worsen by the day, and the bitterness of his own failure gnawed at his conscience. "Do you ever think about how it's all gonna end, Sam?" Michael asked, his voice low and filled with doubt. "How do you keep going knowing there's no end in sight?" Sam looked at him for a moment, his eyes steady before he answered. "You don't think about the end, Mike. You think about the next moment. You take one step at a time. You don't look for answers in the future. The answers are in what you're doing right now." Michael wasn't sure he understood, but there was something in Sam's words that made sense. It wasn't about the end, it was about surviving the present. And right now he had to survive. For his mother. For himself. The next morning, Michael found himself standing in front of the hospital where his mother was being treated. He hadn't been back here in weeks, not since he had lost everything. But today he needed to see her. He had to see her, to hold her hand, to tell her he wasn't done yet. He stood outside for what felt like hours, watching the flow of people entering and exiting the building. He had no idea how to get in. He had no money, no status, nothing that could get him past the reception desk. But he couldn't just turn away now. His stomach turned with the hunger that had been gnawing at him for days, and he tried to push the feeling away. He couldn't afford to let his body weaken. Not now. Just as he was about to turn around and leave, a familiar voice called out to him. "Mike. Michael?" He turned and there stood Laura, his former assistant. She looked the same, professional, pristine, her face filled with concern as she rushed over to him. "Michael, my God, you look, what happened to you?" Her voice was filled with disbelief. "You've been gone for weeks. I've been trying to reach you. Your mother? She needs you." Michael's heart skipped a beat at the mention of his mother. "Is she, what's happening to her? Why didn't anyone tell me?" Laura's face softened with compassion. She's getting worse, Michael. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do. They've given up, but she won't stop asking for you. Every day she asks me when you'll come to see her. She doesn't even recognize the others anymore, just you. His breath caught in his chest. His mother was slipping away and he had no way to save her. No way to get the money, no way to get her the care she needed. The weight of the world pressed on his shoulders, and for a moment, Michael felt like he might collapse under it. I don't have anything left, Laura, Michael said, his voice barely a whisper. I've got nothing. I can't even buy her a single pill. I failed her. Laura's expression softened, and she reached out to touch his arm. No, Michael. You haven't failed her. You've just lost your way. But you're not alone. I'll help you. We'll figure it out together. Michael looked at her, surprised by the kindness in her eyes. He had abandoned everyone, had pushed everyone away, but here she was, offering help without hesitation. Maybe it wasn't too late after all. Maybe there was still hope. I don't know how, Michael said, the words heavy with frustration. I've lost everything, Laura. I don't know if I can get it back. She smiled softly, her voice steady. You don't have to get it back, Michael. You just have to keep moving forward. Together we can find a way. As the days passed, Laura became Michael's anchor. She gave him the direction he so desperately needed. She helped him reconnect with his former life, slowly, carefully, one step at a time. They started small, contacting old colleagues, making calls, looking for any opportunities that might exist in the shadows of his past life. It wasn't easy, and every moment felt like a battle, but slowly Michael began to build something again. A plan. A glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, his mother's condition continued to worsen. Each time Michael visited her at the hospital, he saw less and less of the woman who had once been strong, vibrant, full of life. She had been his rock, and now she was a fragile shell, fading with every passing day. His heart broke every time he saw her. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her. But he kept pushing forward, determined to find a way to save her. One evening, as Michael sat by her bedside, holding her hand, a thought struck him. If he couldn't do it on his own, maybe he didn't have to. He remembered the people he had once known, the powerful figures from his past, the ones who had once called him a friend. They hadn't left him because they were bad people. They had left him because he had fallen from grace. But now, as he sat here, struggling to hold on to the pieces of the life he once had, he realized something important. He could rebuild his empire. Not for the money, but for her. He could do it. And he would. The road ahead would be long, and the odds seemed impossible. But Michael had learned something in these last few weeks. He had learned what it meant to truly fight, not for wealth or power, but for something far greater. For love. And so, with a heart full of resolve, Michael vowed to do whatever it took to save his mother. No more compromises. No more running. He was going to rebuild from the ground up, and nothing was going to stop him. Michael stood on the precipice of everything he once knew, looking down at the life he had left behind. The world, once his playground, now seemed distant and alien. He had spent weeks scavenging, begging, and surviving, but the truth was, he hadn't truly started living again until that moment. The moment he decided he was going to rebuild everything. It wasn't just about money or power, it was about love, about redemption, about honoring the one person who had always believed in him, his mother. The phone rang as he was pacing in the small room he now called his own, a grimy basement apartment where the scent of dampness lingered in the air. He grabbed it quickly, his heart racing with anticipation. It was Laura. Michael, she said, her voice filled with urgency. I've got something for you. You need to meet me tonight. His heart skipped a beat. What is it? He could hear the quiet rush of traffic in the background as she spoke. I can't say much, but it's big. If you're serious about making a comeback, this could be your shot. Michael's thoughts raced as he hung up. He knew he had no choice but to take this risk. Whatever she had, whatever opportunity was coming his way, he had to seize it. His mother needed him, and he would do anything to give her a chance at life. The meeting took place in a small, nondescript coffee shop at the edge of the city, far from the glamorous offices and corporate towers Michael once inhabited. It was the kind of place where people came to hide, to escape from the world outside. And Michael, too, was hiding from the harsh reality that he might not be able to save her. But now there was hope again. It was something small, something fragile, but it was enough to reignite the spark that had nearly died out. Laura was waiting for him at a corner booth, her face a mixture of exhaustion and excitement. "Sit down," she said, motioning to the empty seat across from her. "You're going to want to hear this." As Michael sat, his eyes never left her face. Laura handed him a folder filled with papers, contracts, and a business proposal. "I've been talking to some people, Michael," she explained. "People who've been watching you. They know about your downfall. They know what you've been through. But they also know what you could become. They're willing to help." Michael looked at the folder, unsure of what he was seeing. He had no money, no collateral, no credibility. What could these people possibly see in him? "They want to invest in you," Laura continued. "They want to help you rebuild your empire. All you have to do is prove you're willing to fight for it." Michael's mind whirled. This was it. His chance. But the fear of failure, the shadow of his past mistakes, loomed large. Could he really do this? Could he climb back to the heights he once knew, after everything he had lost? "Who are they?" Michael asked, trying to steady his voice. "They're people who've been through the fire themselves," Laura replied. "They know what it's like to lose everything. And they know what it takes to rise again. You have to make a decision, Michael. Are you ready to fight for your future, or are you going to let the past keep you down?" Her words stung, but they also ignited something within him. He had been living in the shadow of his past for too long. It was time to step into the light, no matter how painful the journey might be. "I'm ready," Michael said, his voice steady, his resolve hardening. "I'll do whatever it takes." Laura smiled, but it wasn't a smile of relief. It was the smile of someone who knew that the road ahead would be long, and the challenges would be greater than Michael could imagine. But she believed in him as much as he was beginning to believe in himself again. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and preparations. Michael was thrust into the business world once more, but this time, everything had changed. His world had been shattered, and now, as he rebuilt it, he understood the true value of every decision. Every contract, every negotiation was no longer about power or wealth. It was about survival. It was about his mother. The business venture wasn't easy. It was full of pitfalls, empty promises, and people who saw Michael as nothing more than a former rich man trying to crawl back into the game. But every day he fought. He fought to earn trust, to prove that he had learned from his mistakes. He pushed forward, relentless in his pursuit of redemption, all while keeping his eyes on the ultimate prize, his mother's health. At night, he would visit her at the hospital. Her condition continued to deteriorate, but each time he saw her, there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a spark of hope that she hadn't lost faith in him. He would sit by her side, holding her hand, telling her about the progress he was making. He would lie sometimes, telling her that everything would be okay, but in truth he didn't know. He didn't know if he could save her. But he wouldn't stop trying. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting, Michael found himself standing outside the hospital, his heart heavy with the weight of the day. He had learned that his mother's condition was worsening faster than anyone had anticipated. The doctors were talking about end-of-life care, and Michael had no answers to give her, no hope to offer. In the stillness of the night, he heard a voice behind him. "You don't have to do this alone, Mike." It was Sam, the war veteran who had become a surrogate father to Michael, the man who had taught him what it meant to survive when everything seemed lost. "You've come a long way, son," Sam continued, his voice gruff but full of affection. "But you need to remember something. It's not all on your shoulders. You don't have to carry the world by yourself." Michael turned to face him, his eyes weary, his spirit broken. I'm losing her, Sam. I'm losing my mom and I don't know how to save her. Sam placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, his grip firm, steady. You're not losing her, Mike. She's still here. You're still here. That's all that matters. You've got the strength to keep going. You just have to believe it. Tears welled in Michael's eyes. The journey had been long, painful, and full of uncertainty. But with Sam's words ringing in his ears, Michael realized something crucial. He wasn't done. Not yet. Not until he had given everything he had, until he had fought with every ounce of strength in his body. He was going to save his mother. He was going to rebuild his life. And he was going to do it not just for himself, but for the woman who had given him everything, even when he didn't deserve it. The days blurred into one another as Michael's life spiraled between the chaos of his business ventures and the agony of his mother's failing health. There was no escape. Every moment of his life now felt like a race against time. Time to build the empire he had once lost, time to make amends, and time to make sure that the woman who had given him everything could see the fruits of his efforts before it was too late. He had begun his journey with ambition, but now, it wasn't about that. It was about survival. It was about the people who had always stood by him, those who had never let go even when he had been at his lowest. His mother, his family, his closest friends, these were the true treasures he sought to protect. Everything else, the money, the power, the fame, those were just means to an end. And now he was determined to use those means for something much greater. However, the road ahead was never easy. There were whispers of betrayal in the air, shadows that Michael couldn't shake. People in the business world, competitors and former allies were circling like vultures. They were all waiting for him to fail. For them, his fall had been inevitable. They had waited for the day when he would crumble under the weight of his own hubris. But they didn't know Michael. They didn't know what he had become. It was in those moments of silence, when the world seemed to close in on him, that he would remember his mother. She had always believed in him even when no one else did. The thought of her, fragile and dependent on him, gave him the strength to push forward, even when he had nothing left. He knew what he had to do. He had to build an empire from nothing. He had to prove to her, and to himself, that he was worth it. But things weren't so simple. One evening, as Michael walked through the city heading toward the office, a car screeched to a halt beside him. The window rolled down and there she was. Laura. Her face was tight with worry. You need to come with me, she said, her voice trembling. There's something you need to see. What's going on? Michael asked, his heart rate spiking. It's not good, Mike, she said, her eyes scanning the street nervously. It's about your company. The investors, they've turned on you. They've pulled their funding. Michael's mind went numb. His thoughts raced. How could this be happening? Everything was falling apart. It had taken months to get this far, and now, just as things were beginning to come together, it was all slipping through his fingers. Why? Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Laura hesitated, her eyes shifting as she tried to find the right words. They don't trust you anymore. They think you're a risk. Too many mistakes. Too much personal baggage. They don't think you're stable enough to lead them to where they want to go. Michael felt the ground shift beneath him like the world was closing in. He had poured every ounce of himself into this comeback, only to be told that he wasn't good enough, that he wasn't worthy of redemption. His mind flashed back to the day he lost everything, when the deals fell apart, when the media tore him apart, when his family's wealth was ripped from their hands. He had made mistakes, yes, but didn't everyone? Didn't they deserve a second chance? As if reading his thoughts, Laura placed a hand on his arm. Mike, I know this feels like the end, but it's not. You've come this far. You can still make it through. There are people who believe in you. You just have to prove it to them. The words hit Michael like a wave, crashing over him, forcing him to face the truth. He was fighting an uphill battle, and it wasn't going to be easy. His past, his mistakes, they were all still hanging over him, casting a long shadow. But he couldn't afford to fall apart now. Not when his mother was depending on him. I'm not done yet, he said quietly, his jaw clenched in determination. "I'm going to fight for this. I'll find another way. I have to." Laura nodded, her expression filled with both admiration and concern. "I'll help you, Mike. But you need to be ready. This isn't going to be a quick fix. You'll have to fight with everything you've got." The next few days were a blur of frantic calls, meetings, and late nights in his office. Michael reached out to anyone who would listen, trying to salvage what he could of his business. He had no choice but to push forward. He couldn't afford to stop now, not when his mother's life was on the line. But the road was treacherous. As his business began to crumble, Michael found himself facing threats from all directions. His competitors, sensing his vulnerability, began to make moves against him, eager to tear him down and claim his place in the market. And even some of the people closest to him, the ones he had trusted most, started to question his ability to lead. The pressure was suffocating. But through it all, Michael remembered his mother. He thought of her every single day. She was the reason he kept going. She was the reason he fought for redemption. And even though he felt like he was being crushed under the weight of everything that was happening, he couldn't give up. Not now. One night, after another grueling day of trying to piece together his shattered empire, Michael received a call. It was from his mother's doctor. "Mr. Warren," the doctor's voice crackled over the line. "We need to talk about your mother's condition. It's urgent." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He could barely breathe as he hurried to the hospital, his mind racing with the worst possibilities. What if it was too late? What if he hadn't done enough? When he arrived, the doctor took him aside and led him to his mother's room. She was lying there, her face pale, her breathing shallow. But when she saw him, her eyes lit up, even if only for a moment. "Michael," she whispered, her voice fragile, like the words might break her. "You look tired." He smiled weakly, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. "I'm okay, Mom. I'm fighting. I'm not giving up." Her eyes softened, and she reached out to touch his hand. "I always believed in you, Michael. You'll make it. I know you will." The words cut through him, a mix of love and sorrow. She had always believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself. It was the one thing that had never changed, the one thing that had always kept him going. "I'm going to make it, Mom. I promise." But deep down he wasn't sure. He wasn't sure if he could make it through. The weight of his failures, the pressure to succeed, it was all too much. But for her he would keep fighting. For her he would never give up. The darkness outside seemed to mirror the turmoil within Michael. As he sat by his mother's bedside, watching her weakly breathe in the sterile, cold hospital room, the weight of everything he had fought for, everything he had lost, felt heavier than ever. His business was crumbling, his relationships strained, and the one person who had always been his anchor, his guiding light, was now fading before his eyes. He had promised her that he would fight, that he would turn everything around. But how could he keep that promise when the world seemed intent on breaking him? The doctors had told him there was little they could do now. His mother's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and the words palliative care had been used more than once. Michael didn't know how to face the reality of losing her. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, chasing a dream that now seemed so trivial compared to the love and sacrifice she had given him. And yet, in the silence of the room, with the beeping of machines in the background, he couldn't escape the feeling that time was running out, but he couldn't give up. Not when she was still holding on, still waiting for him to prove himself. To prove that all the sacrifices, all the pain hadn't been in vain. He couldn't let her go without showing her that he was capable of turning things around. He was determined to give her the legacy she deserved, even if it meant risking everything. The next day, Michael found himself standing in front of his office building, staring up at the glass and steel structure he had once been so proud of. It seemed like a lifetime ago when he had walked into this building with the world at his feet. Now it felt like the last place he should be. But there was no turning back. He had to face the truth of his situation. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The people he had once trusted, the investors, the employees who had stood by him, were all looking at him with a mixture of doubt and disappointment. The walls seemed to close in around him, and Michael felt the familiar pang of panic rise in his chest. "Mr. Warren," one of his former colleagues, Henry, said, his voice cold. "We need to talk about the future of the company. I think you know where things are headed." Michael tried to steady his breathing, to calm the storm that raged inside of him. He had no choice but to face the reality of the situation. He had made mistakes, huge mistakes, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He clenched his fists, determined not to let them see how broken he truly was. "I'm not going to give up," he said, his voice firm despite the doubt gnawing at him. "This company means everything to me. I've worked too hard to let it all slip away." Henry shook his head, a look of pity crossing his face. "You've already lost control, Michael. The investors are pulling out. We've been through this too many times. There's no saving it." Michael's heart sank, but he didn't show it. He knew this moment was coming. He knew that his mistakes had caught up with him, but he couldn't afford to let it defeat him. He had to find a way to fight back, to claw his way out of this hole, no matter the cost. "I'll find a way," Michael muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. "I'll prove you wrong." Later that night, in the quiet of his office, Michael sat alone, staring at the empty desk. The stacks of paperwork, the financial reports, the deals that had once seemed so promising, now they all felt meaningless. The dreams he had worked so tirelessly for, the vision of becoming one of the wealthiest men in the world, seemed so far out of reach. His mind raced, filled with doubt and regret. He thought about his mother, about her fragile state, and the promise he had made to her. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't let her be the one to witness his failure. But the odds were stacked against him. Without investors, without backing, the company was doomed. There was nothing left to do but salvage whatever he could and hope that it would be enough. In the midst of his thoughts, his phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but Michael answered anyway. "Mr. Warren," the voice on the other end said, sharp and businesslike. "We've been following your company for some time. We know things haven't been easy for you, but we think we can help." Michael's heart skipped a beat. Was this the lifeline he had been waiting for? Was this his chance to turn everything around? "We're willing to offer you a partnership," the voice continued. "But you need to prove that you're willing to make the hard decisions. You need to show us that you can still lead, that you still have what it takes." Michael's mind raced. A partnership? Was this his chance to get back on track? But at what cost? He had no idea who was on the other end of the line, and he couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. Still, he knew that he had no choice but to take the risk. "I'm listening," Michael said, his voice steady, even though his heart was pounding. The voice outlined the terms, difficult terms, but terms that could save his company. It was a hard pill to swallow, but Michael knew that he had no other choice. He agreed to the deal, signing his name without hesitation. As soon as the call ended, Michael sat back in his chair, a sense of relief washing over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. This was it. This was his chance to redeem himself. But just as quickly, the reality of his situation settled back in. The company was far from saved, and his mother's condition continued to worsen. He had made a deal with people he didn't trust, and he still had no idea what would happen next. Every decision he made felt like a risk, every move uncertain. And then there was the guilt, the crushing weight of guilt. For all of his ambition, for all of his drive to succeed, he had neglected the most important thing in his life, the people who loved him. His mother, who had always stood by him, was slipping away, and all he could do was watch. He had spent so much time fighting for success that he had forgotten to fight for the things that truly mattered. As he walked back to the hospital, the weight of the day settled on him like a burden he could no longer ignore. He had made progress, yes, but at what cost? Would it be enough to save everything he cared about, or had he lost it all for nothing? When he reached his mother's room, he found her awake, her eyes bright with recognition. She smiled weakly when she saw him, reaching out for his hand. "Michael," she whispered, her voice fragile but full of love. "I'm so proud of you." The words tore at him. How could she still be proud of him after everything he had put her through? How could she still believe in him when he had failed so many times? "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for everything." She squeezed his hand, her frail fingers tightening around his. "You've always been my son, Michael. And I've always believed in you. You just have to believe in yourself." Tears welled up in Michael's eyes as he sat beside her, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. He wasn't sure if he would ever be able to forgive himself for the mistakes he had made. But in that moment he realized something. His journey wasn't just about building wealth or power. It was about redemption. It was about finding the strength to rise from the ashes, to rebuild not just his business but his life. And with that, Michael vowed that he would never give up, not for the money, not for the power, but for the love of the woman who had always believed in him. The sun rose slowly, casting long shadows across the city skyline. For the first time in weeks, Michael felt a strange sense of clarity. It was as if the world had momentarily paused, and in that stillness, he could see things more clearly than ever before. He had made the decision to fight, but now he needed to figure out what that fight would look like. It was no longer just about money or power. This battle was deeper, more personal, and far more complicated. His mother's condition was deteriorating with every passing day, and he was running out of time. Yet, despite the overwhelming sense of urgency, Michael knew that this was the moment to make a real change. He couldn't afford to keep chasing the same empty dreams he had been before. The success he had once longed for had been hollow, and he couldn't let that define him anymore. Walking through the hospital corridor that day felt different. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, but in that hum, he could almost hear his mother's voice in his head, telling him to keep going. She had always been his greatest support, the one person who believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. Now it was his turn to live up to her faith. When he walked into her room, she was sleeping peacefully, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Michael took a moment to just watch her, feeling the sting of guilt rise in his chest. How many times had he taken her for granted? How many opportunities had he missed to simply sit with her, to appreciate her presence? His mind replayed the moments when he had been too absorbed in his ambitions to listen to her, too distracted by his own ambitions to understand the gravity of the love she had always given him. He knew that he couldn't go back in time, but he could make the most of what little time he had left. He pulled a chair up to her bedside and sat down, taking her hand in his. His mother's grip was weak, but she still managed to offer him a smile, one that was filled with the kind of unconditional love that only a mother could give. "I'm here, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to fix things. I promise you." Her eyes fluttered open and she blinked at him slowly as though trying to focus. "I know you will," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But remember, Michael, it's not about the money. It's about the heart. The people you love." Those words hit him harder than any business deal, any failure, or any victory he had ever experienced. He realized then that all of his past ambitions had been misplaced. He had focused on building an empire, but the real value, his real legacy, was in the people he had touched along the way, the lives he had impacted, and the love he had given and received. The nurse entered the room quietly, adjusting the drip in his mother's fore. Michael stood up, giving her space to work, but his mind was racing. His mother's words echoed in his head. He had been so obsessed with success that he had forgotten the most important thing of all: love. And it was this love, this drive to do better for those he cared about, that would fuel his next step. Michael spent the next few days in a whirlwind of activity. He knew he couldn't save his company with the same old tactics. The old ways of doing business had failed him, and he couldn't rely on those same methods. He needed to pivot, to embrace something new, something more authentic. He had made his fortune through cold deals and sharp business moves, but now he needed to rebuild his life, not through manipulation but through genuine connection and care. He spent long hours researching new opportunities, consulting with experts, and brainstorming with people who had a different vision than his own. Michael needed to evolve. He couldn't keep clinging to the past. During this time, his relationship with the investors who had come forward began to deepen. They were a group of risk-takers just like him, but they didn't just focus on the bottom line. They wanted to build something meaningful, something sustainable. Michael saw this as a potential turning point, a chance to finally do business in a way that aligned with his personal growth. The more he worked with them, the more he realized that the business world was changing. The focus was no longer just about raw profit. It was about impact, about creating something that would outlast the people behind it. They discussed social entrepreneurship, sustainable business practices, and ways to invest in the future. Michael felt a surge of hope. This was it, the kind of venture he had always dreamed of, but in a form that was aligned with his own moral compass. But even as he began to rebuild his company, a deeper struggle loomed. His mother's health continued to decline. Every phone call from the hospital filled him with dread, yet he knew he couldn't stop. He had to keep moving forward, keep fighting. She had given him everything, and now, it was his turn to honor her by becoming the man she always believed he could be. In the late hours of the night, when everything else seemed to fade away, Michael found himself in the quiet solitude of his thoughts. He had come a long way, but there was still so much more to do. And yet, despite the weight of the world pressing down on him, he couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. As he sat in his office, reflecting on the choices he had made, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was one of the investors he had been working closely with, Sarah. She walked in with a smile, and for the first time in weeks, Michael felt a spark of hope. "I think we've got something here, Michael," she said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "This new direction, it's going to work. People are going to believe in this." Her words lifted something heavy from Michael's chest. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the journey, about rebuilding something meaningful. And in that moment he knew that despite everything that had happened, he was on the right path, but his personal battle was far from over. The days blurred into one another, and as his company started to gain momentum, his mother's condition worsened. Every day he faced the same grim reality. He couldn't save her no matter how hard he tried. But he could honor her memory by living a life that reflected the values she had instilled in him. It wasn't just about financial success anymore. It was about the people he cared about, the impact he could make, and the legacy he would leave behind. He wasn't fighting for wealth. He was fighting for redemption. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Michael returned to the hospital. His mother was unconscious, her breathing shallow, but her hands still gripped his tightly. He whispered to her, as he had every day, reminding her of the promise he had made. "I'm doing it, Mom. I'm turning everything around. For you." And as he sat there, holding her hand, Michael finally understood what it meant to truly fight, not just for himself but for the people he loved. He wasn't done yet. There was still a long road ahead, but with each step, he was moving closer to the man he had always been meant to become. The weight of the world pressed down on Michael's shoulders. The relentless ticking of the clock seemed to echo in the stillness of the room as he sat by his mother's bedside. Each breath she took was weaker than the last. Time was running out, and Michael could feel it slipping through his fingers like sand. Despite everything he had achieved, every business deal, every partnership, none of it seemed to matter now. His mother's frailty was a stark reminder that no amount of wealth could turn back the hands of time. But Michael had learned something crucial during his journey. It wasn't the accumulation of money, power, or status that defined him. It was his ability to change, to fight for the people who mattered, and to rebuild from the ashes. And now, with his mother's life hanging by a thread, Michael knew he had one last battle to face, a battle for redemption. The new business venture had begun to take off, much to his surprise. The investors believed in him, and slowly but surely Michael was building something meaningful, something that could outlast his own failures. But as he sat there watching his mother slip away, he understood that it wasn't about the empire he was building, it was about the relationships, the people he loved, and the legacy he would leave behind. Michael had made his promise to her, but he knew there was still so much more he needed to do. He couldn't save her, but he could honor her by living up to the values she had always taught him. He had become a man of integrity, someone who could be proud of his actions, and he was determined to keep moving forward, even in the face of the greatest loss of his life. That night, after the doctors had left and the lights in the hospital dimmed, Michael found himself alone in the quiet room with his mother. Her hand was limp in his, but he held on tightly, refusing to let go. The world outside seemed to blur, as if everything had paused just for him, giving him this final moment to say goodbye. "I love you, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm going to make you proud. I'll keep fighting. I promise." Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them back. He had made it this far, and he wasn't about to stop now. The promise he made to his mother had fueled his transformation, but now, it was time to see it through. He needed to take the next step. His company was on the brink of success, but it was still fragile. There were risks, challenges, and decisions that could make or break everything. He spent the next few days in a whirlwind of meetings, calls, and brainstorming sessions. The world outside seemed to move at an unrelenting pace, but Michael was consumed with a singular focus. He was building something that mattered, something real. And even as his mother's health continued to decline, he was determined to give his all, to prove that he could do this. For her. The investors had been waiting for him to make a move, to fully commit to the vision they had shared. But Michael couldn't just jump in blindly. He had learned the hard way that decisions made in haste could lead to disastrous outcomes. No, this time he needed to be strategic. He needed to build this company on solid ground, brick by brick, ensuring that it would be sustainable and impactful. But the pressure was mounting. The stakes had never been higher. Every move he made seemed to carry the weight of his past mistakes, his regrets, and his hopes for the future. And then, just as everything seemed to be falling into place, Michael faced the ultimate test. One that would challenge everything he had worked for, everything he had become. The board meeting was scheduled, and the tension in the room was palpable. Michael sat at the head of the table, his mind racing. The investors were excited about the direction the company was heading, but they wanted to see more. They wanted results, and they wanted them fast. They had invested millions, and they were looking for a return. "We need to see numbers, Michael," one of the investors said, his voice stern. "We've been patient, but it's time to show us the fruits of your labor." Michael felt the pressure mounting. He knew that this moment could make or break everything. If he made the wrong move, it could all fall apart. But he also knew that this was his chance to prove himself, not just to the investors but to himself. "I understand," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "But this isn't just about numbers. This is about building something that lasts, something that means something. I'm not here just to make money, I'm here to make a difference,